Yeah, so first time for me doing this, so it's kind of interesting. But if uh, if you want me to go ahead and get started, really, I just have a minute or two kind of introduction that I can offer, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have if there's anything about my poster that seems intriguing. Um, but transformational learning is an adult learning theory, and it's a really fascinating one. It basically seeks to explore how adults make shifts in their perspective of how they either view themselves or others or the world around them. And unlike many adult learning theories, at least in general, transformational learning doesn't just understand learning as something that's behavioral or cognitive, but also convictional and psychological and sociological and emotional. And it's a very fascinating theory. You can kind of understand transformational learning in the workplace as what happens when a really bad manager, perhaps he or she is cold and distant and self-serving, becomes a really good manager, one who is warm and invitational and others focused, right? What's going on there when that shift takes place? That could be transformational learning. In society, you can kind of understand transformational learning as what happens when perhaps someone with racist perspectives becomes one who is not a racist. So it's this idea of core transformation in worldview and perspective. Um, and perhaps the only thing that matches the fascination that some have had with transformational learning is the criticism that others have had with the theory. And so what I did was a literature review. So what I wanted to do was kind of survey where the academic thought was right now around transformational learning, the past 10 years or so of critical literature. And I wanted to see that if I could identify any trends in that literature of what's exactly being said about it, what are some of the most common critiques, what are the gaps that are being identified. I wanted to try to draw some implications of those criticisms, and then I wanted to try to outline a very brief kind of path forward, maybe how we could move the dialogue in a positive direction to continue developing the theories. So my poster, I think it outlines pretty typical my purpose, method, conclusions, implications, and in the center there you see those are the four trends that I identified in all the literature that I was surveying. So the first one is alternative conceptions. That's basically practitioners have taken the initial kind of tome of transformational learning, authored by a guy named Jack Mesereau in the 70s. And there's been a lot of alternative conceptions, kind of baseline staying with Mesereau's kind of general thought, but then taking it sometimes in very, very different directions. The second trend would be pondering cause. And that's really getting at this question of what is it that practitioners ought to be targeting to see transformational learning take place, right? So with behaviorism, you're targeting the motor domains and behaviors. With certain cognitive theories of adult learning, you're targeting uh, cognitive abilities and things like that. So what is it that we should be targeting to try to see transformational learning take place? The third trend was this use of what I'm calling identity language, and there's a lot of different terms that you can insert there to use in place of identity, but it's basically some practitioners trying to get at what is it that we ought to be targeting to see transformational learning take place. So what is it about that bad manager that needs to be targeted to catalyze some form of learning that is so transformative that he goes from being a bad manager to a good manager? And there's starting to be some consensus around this idea of identity language. And then the fourth trend, which is somewhat perhaps of an absence of a trend, is that most of the literature uh, in the last 10 years or so, particularly the critical literature, it's very theoretical. So it lacks a lot of practical implications. How do we do this? How do we close the gap between theory and practice? What is it that we can implement in a repeatable way, and therefore then measure to see if we can successfully implement some sort of strategy of transformational learning? So that's kind of a nutshell of what I did. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
So I have a question, like, how do you measure the different, I guess, the different trends? Like, how do you, if you see a pattern or you see that maybe they're transforming using that trend, is there a way to measure it? Or
To measure the actual trend?
yeah, like them trending that way or whatever, or do you just notice that that's what they've done? I mean,
Yeah, so again, so this was being a literature review. Really, what I did was there was a certain set of search terms in the searching methodology that we use, or that I used to try to identify papers that would fit into the category of critical literature, trying to get at practical applications of transformational learning. So once I tried to identify a larger group of papers that I wanted to look through, it really was a process of just reading and highlighting and trying to analyze and synthesize and put some things together in spreadsheets. So it's not, the trends perhaps aren't quantifiable, right? There's not a lot of data that you're looking at in that sense of quantifiable trends, but it's more so I was trying to act as a barometer for where the dialogue is at. So there is a certain measure of subjectivity that I'm sure plays into that.
yeah.
But in general, I'd be confident to say that based on the pieces that I surveyed, these are the trends that are prevalent there.
Okay.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the implications?
Yeah. So going through all this and identifying these trends, there was a pretty interesting thing that I noticed, and that's really the trends 2 and 3. So pondering cause, what causes this, and then the use of identity language. So upon its inception, there's a journal called the Journal of Transformative Education, and upon its inception, the journal called for academically provocative solutions to transformational learning. So things that you wouldn't typically think of, perhaps, that are the most easily quantifiable, because you're really dealing with you're dealing with these kind of big ideas that impact society and the workplace, not just meeting numbers. And that's really the core of why transformational learning has received such criticism, because when you're talking about ideas like that, it really is hard to quantify them, right? How do you quantify a good manager? You know, you often in the workplace hear these things like, well, maybe he's not cut out or she's not cut out to be a people manager. You know, it's kind of a subjective perspective of how you interact and relate to people. And that's why, like I said, transformational learning is so interesting in that it really leans into psychology and sociology about how people interact with people, and about how people view themselves and view the world around them. Whereas adult learning largely is very scientific in how we look at catalyzing learning in the workplace and in various other institutions of society. So my implications to your question more specifically, that's kind of context, is that it really seems like the recent critical literature, it really seems like we're onto something. But I think to develop it further, we have to be willing and able to try to explore some of these provocative, non-rational, non-typical domains of human emotion, human conviction, human belief systems. And the real work that would be done is to figure out how can we analyze those things? How can we, to a degree, quantify those things to develop a strategy for implementing transformational learning, and then also to be able to assess its success. And so my implications are kind of summing that up and saying, this is what we need to be getting at to dive deeper into this. And then the path forward section is kind of a very rudimentary hypothesis about some things that we could explore a little bit further, by way of developing a strategy that could be implemented to catalyze transformational learning and then therefore assess its success.
Thank you. Any questions? Is there another question in the chat?
Oh, I do see a chat here. Joe, can you share your poster online? I'm sure that's possible. I don't know how. I'm sorry. That was Steve. I could certainly email it to you, and I'd be happy to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. I guess if I think about transformational learning, two things strike me. One is that it's one of those things where probably all of us have experienced some form of it. It's also one of those things that's very hard to categorize, plan for, or measure. If I think about, personally what happened to me as I went from being a competent instructional designer to a person who was a senior instructional designer who managed other people's work, that was transformational, because suddenly it's not just instructional design anymore. It's all this management stuff about quality and schedule and budget and building process and capacity. And that was a major change in all the variables that you mentioned. I guess if I want to use transformational learning effectively to help people make these kinds of career changes, what kinds of suggestions could you offer for doing that in a workplace setting?
Yeah, and so I tried to think hard about good examples to use, right? Because that's often the best way to communicate. And I think one of those examples really is, relating to that manager. And so perhaps we fall into the broader category of leadership development. When you're talking about that potentially bad manager who's old and a bit self-serving, what are the suggestions that I would make based on what I'm seeing here and these calls for non-practical kind of identity language solutions? That's where I call out in that path forward section on my poster, which obviously you don't have before you, but there's three things there, and it's struggle, story, and something I call connectedness. And so struggle, Mesereau, his theory, one of the first things that he called out was this thing called a disorienting dilemma. And that was, you face some sort of just shift or mix-ups, a wrench gets thrown into your gears. And so the experience of struggle or the observation of struggle within others, I think can really be used. I don't think it's something that we think of using typically, but I think that experience or observation of that struggle can really be used. So in the example of that manager, he or she's probably struggling to be effective. Maybe his performance ratings, the folks he manages perhaps aren't giving him great reviews, and that's also probably causing the job of those he manages to be a bit of a struggle. So trying to kind of unpack that a little bit and expose that, I think is one piece. And then the next piece I would call story, which is really compelling narratives, because if we're trying to target identity, which is wrapped up in psychology, sociology, emotions, convictions, spreadsheets typically don't do that for people, at least for a lot of people, but compelling narratives do. And I often think of, you see a lot of these documentaries, and certain documentaries I think are actually wonderful examples of transformational learning. whether they be things like blackfish, exposing, you know, how animals are treated, or food Inc., different things like that. That's really an attempt at creating a compelling narrative that is targeting a person's perspectives and worldview. And it's doing it in such a way that their hope is to create a shift in perspective. And so I think those are examples. And then connectedness kind of has its roots in communities of practice in the workplace. And like I said, so that last bit is really based on everything that the research that I did in trying to understand the gaps that were being identified and criticisms that were being offered. This is really my very rudimentary hypothesis about what are some ways that could be studied a little bit more to figure out how to make a strategy that can be implemented in the workplace or other institutions of society that can be then assessed as to whether or not they're successful in creating transformation. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
What kinds of things would you put in the environment to support this? You know, learning is one of those things that happens at the level of the individual. Yeah. Kinds of environmental supports might you put in place in terms of data or instruments or incentives in support of this?
Yeah, and so answering that question is certainly probably beyond the scope of what I initially did. So I could rattle off perhaps you know, some ideas off the top of my head, but I probably wouldn't be able to back them up with a lot of deep analysis because I didn't really go there. My focus was really to try to understand where the dialogue was at and kind of synthesize that and have a really good understanding of that, and then be able to articulate it along with some you know, suggestions or thoughts or kind of questions that perhaps might lead to some aha moments. So I wouldn't want to pretend to you know, offer some really great answers to that one because I didn't really go there in much depth. I do think I am 1 minute past my time. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, it does. It goes by fast. But
I would want to also call out the acknowledgement. Lisa is on the call here, and she's provided a lot of help to me. I've bounced ideas back and forth off of her. This was initially a project that I worked on in 531, a class that she was on. And so, yeah, thank you so much for all of your help and support through that, Lisa. Really appreciate it.
Well, you did a wonderful job, Joe.
Joe rocks. Yay.
Joe does rock.
All right. Well, I don't want to go into anyone else's time. I don't know how exactly this meeting is set up, but I think it's time for me to sign off. So I just want to say thank you.
We got the next person waiting. Great job. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Well done, Joe.
Have a good one.